The demand for electricity in British Columbia is not living up to the forecasts that BC Hydro has been making. Every couple of years, they do a comprehensive forecast. They add up all the houses and the new people coming to the province and the industry and the commercial and they produce a trajectory off into the future. And by complete accident, this always turns out to be 2% a year forever. If the forecast was 2% in 1995, it was 2% in 2005, it was 2% in 2010, 2012, 2013, 2016. The reality has been short of that. It has been flat since 2005. The demand now is just about what it was then. A little wobble around 2008, but it went down, came back up, and it's been flat. Nor do we expect it to grow very much. The industrial demand for electricity has been falling. In fact, it's down about 16% in the last decade, largely because the forestry industry has had hard times. We've cut all the trees, no more logging to do, no more paper to be made, substantial disinvestment in favor of Georgia and Louisiana. So that's gone, we're going. The commercial demand has been flat, in part because there are off-grid alternatives, but really because conservation starts to make sense as prices begin to rise. For consumers, efficiencies are matching population growth. People are paying attention to when they buy new refrigerators or when they buy LED lights instead of incandescent bulbs and so on. So that's a wash. Population is growing slowly. Efficiency is also growing slowly. The justification behind the forecast that was made in 2013 for the panel was that ordinary organic growth in British Columbia from residential, commercial, and industrial uses would add up to this roughly 2% a year. Nothing special was thrown into that equation. A relatively small kind of placeholder number was entered for the demand from the LNG industry, which was going to be upon us momentarily. But other than that, nothing special was thrown in. There wasn't a figure for electric cars, for example. It was just too small to be counted. Likewise, the assumption on the demand side was that people would only be rational if they were bribed to do so. That is, there had to be a positive expenditure by BC Hydro, so you lower your bill if you get the right kind of appliance or something like that, in order to see any efficiency changes. Well, that's turned out not to be true. People do the smart things anyway. Elasticity is a big thing in forecasting. If something gets more expensive, you tend to buy less of it. You might substitute something, you might conserve it, but you're going to buy less of it. There are very, very few exceptions, and Tiffany sells most of them. The price of electricity in British Columbia was essentially flat from 1970 through to about 2013 or 14. In real terms, it was so low that none of us had to pay attention to it. It just wasn't part of the calculus. Since 2014 in particular, prices have started to rise in real terms quite rapidly, and they're forecast to do so essentially forever. Certainly up through the time when the bill for Site C hits the rates, and then it will take off again. So we would expect that to have an effect on demand. As I say, prices are rising about 3 times the rate of inflation in nominal terms. And because of some accounting shenanigans in BC Hydro, that's going to continue for a long time. If you chose a kind of the middle of the road number for demand elasticity for electricity from many other utilities across North America, you would probably get a number around 0.4 or 0.5. That means that if elasticity is 0.5, that means that demand is going to fall by half. That's quite a lot. That's not a year-to-year thing. That's after the complete relaxation and substitution of capital goods and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of fall in demand that you might expect to see over 4 to 7 years, let's say. And that's entirely aside from this cross-elasticity issue, which has to do with the prices of other goods, other sources of energy. So for all those reasons, I conclude that we're not going to need a whole lot more electrical energy for some time to come. Decades. Decades, given that we are already producing much more than we can sell. Hydro produces about 70 terawatt hours a year, sells about 50. They need some reserve in hand for disasters and transmission line breaks and so on and so forth. They need, of course, some peaking power, which is separate from this energy figure. But no matter how you slice it, they've got more than they need now. And there are at least 5 alternatives should we turn out to need new supply in the short term, let's say the next 10 or 20 years. We are entitled to the use of half of the incremental power that was generated on the Columbia River on the US side by the building of the storage dams in Canada. That averages about 1,300 megawatts a year, rather more than Site C, you'll note. A little bit less in energy terms, 4,000 against 5,000, but still very much the same kind of resource. We currently accept that at the border, and it goes for about 2 feet in Canada, and we sell it back to the States at the spot market price. Last measured number was $22.46 US a megawatt hour. Put that, I might say, against the cost of hydro, of Site C, which is going to be close enough to $100, maybe $105 a megawatt hour. In other words, we could have all of Site C, if we need it, at a quarter of the price. BC Hydro also estimated, this is very loosey-goosey back of the envelope estimate, that there was about 700 megawatts of geothermal power available in British Columbia at competitive prices. The prices competitive with Site C is what they meant. When BC Hydro first proposed Site C in about 1981, they went to the Utilities Commission for approval. And in a decision in 1983, the Utilities Commission said, you haven't done your homework. Let's see your demand numbers. And by the way, we think you should go explore the geothermal potential of British Columbia. 34 years ago, and the homework hasn't been done. They also put together a suite of geothermal, of hydro, small hydro, wind and solar installations that would add up to the same amount as Site C, and said that that could be built for the same price as Site C. They didn't want to do that because that would all be done by independent power producers. And there is, of course, the issue of the old Burrard thermal plant in Vancouver, which again is about the same size as Site C. It was closed because the good people of the Fraser Valley objected to the smog that would occur when winter inversions would trap the exhaust in the valley. Okay, fair enough. But if that plant were used 4 or 5 days a year, just as a peaking power plant, it would itself substantially lower the requirement for any kind of new generation for peaking. But the fifth alternative is the obvious one, and that's conservation. We can talk at length about how to do that, but I noticed that this was put forward by no less a person than the former CEO of BC Hydro. It cost him his job. So, if we build it, suppose they bill it for the 8.8 billion that they've confessed as opposed to the 7.9 that they told regulators. There is no domestic market for this. It would take $1 billion worth of new transmission equipment to move it to Alberta, even assuming you could persuade the Albertans to buy it. The Albertans can generate all the power they want from natural gas at around $55 a megawatt hour. If we have to sell them Peace River power, Site C power, we would be just locking in a loss of about $50 a megawatt hour for the life of whatever contracts we could get. If you use the other alternative, and that is well, maybe there's two alternatives. You can persuade some LNG operator to use it by granting highly concessionary rates, which is what's happened at Woodfibre. But even then, that's not going to go anywhere because no big LNG plants anywhere in the world use grid electricity. There's one example in Norway, and that's a very special case. Everybody else uses their own natural gas. So you got to dump it on the U.S. market at spot market prices. Assume that that's $25 a megawatt hour. That would lock in a loss of $128, $128 million a year. With no payment on the principal. You may recall that the current financing proposal from the government of British Columbia is that this thing will be financed on an interest-only basis for 70 years with no payment on principal. That'd be a nice mortgage if you could get it. And that also assumes that they can roll over debt at these very large volumes at prices below 3% indefinitely. This is delusional. So even under these wild assumptions, if you did all that, you'd pay $9 billion in interest over the 70 years, and you'd still owe the full 8.8. And that's what we as ratepayers and taxpayers would get to face. Now, well, that's really summarizing. The bottom line is the financing risk on this thing is crazy, and it's all yours. And that's where I think I should stop. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Swain, speaking as someone who's been involved in environmental assessment for many years, your report was a model of its kind. Could you please give us some understanding of why the government chose not to accept the conclusion?
Thank you. The government, I think, had a very clear idea that it wanted to build this dam and would take the minimum necessary steps to clear the way for that to happen. This is in fact on? Okay.
It's on, it's the right.
Okay.
It's working. You just want to be close to it.
Okay. To that effect, they gave the environmental assessment panel a very restrictive set of guidelines. They said, among other things, that we were not to opine on whether or not there are treaty right infringements. We were just to simply list what the First Nations had to say. We were not allowed to count the Columbia River entitlement as part of BC's assured supply, thus making the supply-demand balance tilt rather dramatically. We had to accept every jot and tittle of what's in Mr. Campbell's Clean Energy Act of 2010, which is, in one sense, a rather high-minded, renewable-oriented kind of piece of legislation, but in the other is, let's say, financially irrational. John's comment about the system optimizer, I think, was kind of interesting because, you know, no matter what numbers you put into the optimizer, it came out Site C. And some of those restrictions were embodied in the Clean Energy Act of 2010. There were restrictions on time in getting it done. We had a grand total of 8 months. We were allowed a month of public hearings. We thought of asking whether they meant a calendar month or 30 days, and then they thought, no, we're not going to ask. We'll just use the 30. We didn't in the end because we allowed for some snow days and had a mild winter. But we had practical difficulties in getting expert help for the panel, even though this was promised in the terms of reference. For example, to go to the economics again, we decided that we as a panel decided we wanted to have an expert on utility economics, and who could guide us at least to the right questions and maybe some of the right conclusions on this. And they said, well, what do you need that for? You got BC Hydro. Well, no, we'd like someone who is independent. Well, all right, then you have to write down exactly everything you want to know from this person. You have to translate it into French. You have to put it up on Merck's. You have to advertise it nationally, and if you insist, internationally, but nationally. You have to choose the cheapest compliant bidder. All right? Well, that would have taken longer than 8 months, so it became a practical impossibility. We had quite a fight to get an independent counsel for the panel. British Columbia said, well, we have Buggins here from the Ministry of the Attorney General. You can use him. No. We then found a couple of very fine individuals, engaged one, and things went along fine. But that took probably a week of the chairman's time early on when we were trying to plow our way through 24,000 pages of environmental impact statement from BC Hydro. So it was a stressful time, and the idea that one could attain perfection in the final report under those circumstances is generous of you, sir.
It's a notion of whoever comes into power, if they're not the current government, they'll be dealing with something called sunk cost. What have they already spent? And I think they're worried about explaining that to the public. It's not a foreign concept. I don't know if you'd like to say anything about that particular problem. It's hard to explain to the public, probably.
Yeah, it is hard to explain. Let's suppose that by election time they've spent $2 billion and there's 7 left to go. Your rational question is always, all right, what does the extra 7 get me? Not what's happened in the past. The answer is the extra 7 gets you $9 billion worth of debt instead of 2. And I don't think at the end of the day that's hard to explain.